Most people spend their entire lives doing things they were told they should want. A good job, a stable income, the right degree, the right neighborhood. And somewhere along the way, quietly, without ever making a big announcement, they stop asking the question that matters most. What is this life actually for? This is not a motivational video. We are not going to ask you to dream bigger or hustle harder. What we are going to do is something far more interesting. We are going to look at what your brain actually does when you feel a sense of purpose, why that feeling is so hard to find, and what neuroscience tells us about a real, structured process for discovering and building a life that feels genuinely meaningful. Not to anyone else, but to you. Because here is the thing that almost no one talks about. Purpose is not something you stumble upon. It is not sitting inside a personality test or hidden in your childhood memories. Purpose is something your brain constructs. And if you understand how that construction works, you can actually influence it. Let's start with the science. Your brain has a system called the default mode network. Scientists first noticed it by accident. They were doing brain imaging studies and realized that when people were asked to simply rest, to do nothing, to let their minds wander, a very specific set of brain regions lit up in a coordinated way. These regions include the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, and the hippocampus. At first, researchers thought this network was just background noise, the brain idling like a parked car. But they were wrong. Further research showed that the default mode network is active when we think about ourselves, when we imagine the future, when we try to understand other people's perspectives, and when we reflect on what matters to us. In other words, the default mode network is the brain's storytelling system. It is where you construct the narrative of who you are and where you are going. And it turns out that the quality of your default mode network activity, how coherent and integrated that internal storytelling is closely linked to whether you feel a clear sense of direction in your life, or whether you feel scattered, purposeless, and lost. Research from neuroscientist Mary Helen Imordino-Yang at the University of Southern California found that people who engaged in deeper self-reflective thinking, the kind that uses the default mode network most fully, showed greater psychological well-being, more pro-social behavior, and stronger feelings of meaning. She described this as the brain building an autobiographical narrative that is rich enough to give direction to behavior. So here is the first key idea. Purpose is not an emotion. It is a cognitive structure. It is a story your brain tells about who you are and where you are going. And just like any story, it can be poorly written, incomplete, or vivid and compelling. The question then becomes, how do you write a better story? To understand that, we need to look at a second brain system, the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which is sometimes called the reward pathway. This system runs from a structure deep in the brain called the ventral tegmental area, up through the nucleus accumbens and into the prefrontal cortex. You have probably heard of dopamine. Most people think of it as the pleasure chemical. That is not quite right. Dopamine is more accurately described as the anticipation chemical. It spikes not just when you get something good, but when your brain predicts that something good is coming. More importantly, dopamine is what your brain uses to encode value. When dopamine is released in the context of a goal or activity, the brain marks that activity as worth pursuing again. Here is what that means for purpose. You do not feel pulled toward something meaningful because it is intrinsically special. You feel pulled toward it because your brain has learned, through repeated experience, to release dopamine in response to that direction. Purpose, at the neurochemical level, is a well-worn dopamine pathway. This is why people who have a clear sense of purpose often report that it feels effortless. The work may be hard, but the direction feels obvious. That is not magic. That is a brain that has been conditioned, through experience and attention, to find deep reward in a particular type of engagement. This also explains why simply thinking about your purpose does not work. Reading books about passion, journaling about what you love, watching inspirational videos, these activate the default mode network briefly, but they do not build the dopamine pathways that make purpose feel real and compelling. For that, you need repeated action. There is a third brain system that matters here, the anterior cingulate cortex, which manages what scientists call conflict monitoring. This region detects when there is a mismatch between what you are doing and what you believe you should be doing. When you live in a way that contradicts your values and identity, the anterior cingulate cortex generates a kind of internal friction, a low-level sense of wrongness, of being out of place. Many people experience this as chronic low-grade anxiety, restlessness, or a vague sense that something is missing. They may mistake this signal for depression, for personality flaws, or for simply being ungrateful. But in many cases, what they are experiencing is their brain's conflict monitor firing because the life they are living does not match the identity their default mode network has constructed. Finding your purpose, neurologically speaking, is partly about reducing this conflict. It is about building alignment between your internal narrative, your daily behavior, and the signals coming from your environment. When these three things line up, the anterior cingulate cortex quiets down. The noise disappears. People describe this state as clarity, as flow, as finally feeling like themselves. Now let's talk about what gets in the way. The biggest enemy of purpose finding is not laziness or fear, though those play a role. The biggest enemy is what psychologists call identity foreclosure. This is when you adopt a fixed identity, defined by family expectations, cultural scripts, career roles, or social pressure, before you have had the chance to actually explore who you are and what you genuinely value. Research by developmental psychologist James Marcia, expanding on Erik Erikson's earlier work, showed that people go through identity statuses across their lives. Some people foreclose early, they commit to a path without exploration, and this often leads to a brittle sense of self. Others remain in what Marcia called identity diffusion. They never commit to anything, staying permanently vague about who they are. The healthiest state is what he called identity achievement, which comes after genuine exploration followed by deliberate commitment. Here is the neuroscience that connects to this. The prefrontal cortex, which governs long-term planning and value-based decision-making, is not fully mature until the mid-20s. But more importantly, the prefrontal cortex needs data. It needs experiences, memories, and feedback from the world in order to build accurate models of what actually satisfies you versus what you only think will satisfy you. Without that experiential data, it makes poor predictions. This means that sitting still and trying to think your way to a purpose, especially when you are young or when you have had a narrow range of life experiences, is neurologically inefficient. Your prefrontal cortex does not have enough to work with. What it needs is input from real experiments in the world. This brings us to the practical protocol. Based on what the neuroscience tells us, here is a 4-phase process for finding and building your unique purpose. This is not a weekend exercise. It is a long-term practice, but each phase has specific actionable steps. You can start today. Phase 1 is called Identity Excavation. The goal of this phase is to audit what is actually in your brain. What stories, values, and patterns are already shaping your default mode network versus what has been placed there by external pressure. Start with what researchers call the life review method, adapted from narrative therapy. Write down the 10 to 15 most vivid memories of your life, moments that felt significant, either positively or negatively. Do not filter for positivity. Painful memories are just as important. Then, for each memory, ask, what was I valuing in that moment? What was I moving toward or away from? Next, identify your chronic complaints. What consistently bothers you about the world, not just personal inconveniences, but patterns you see in society, in your field, in human behavior, that you find yourself repeatedly frustrated by. This matters because your chronic complaints often point toward what you care about most. The person who is perpetually frustrated by miscommunication probably deeply values clarity and connection. The person who is constantly bothered by injustice probably has a strong orientation toward fairness and equity. Your complaints are your values in disguise. Finally, write your roles inventory. List every role you play in life, professional, relational, social, and rank each one by how much energy it gives you versus drains from you. This gives you a felt sense map of where your default mode network is already generating positive versus negative narrative. Phase 2 is called Experiential Prototyping. Now you take what you found in Phase 1 and you test it against reality. You design small, low-cost experiments to generate new experiential data for your prefrontal cortex. The key constraint here is that each experiment must have a real outcome. It cannot just be reading about something. You need to actually do it, in public, with stakes. This is what triggers dopamine encoding. The brain does not mark experiences as meaningful until they involve genuine effort and real-world feedback. Spend 90 days doing 1 to 3 exploratory activities per month that align with your Phase 1 findings. These can be small: a weekend workshop, volunteering for one project, teaching something you know to one person, writing one essay, starting one conversation with someone who does work that interests you. After each experiment, ask 2 questions. First, did this feel expansive or contractive? Expansive means you wanted more of it. Contractive means you were relieved when it was over. Second, did time distort? Did the activity create what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, a state where time seemed to speed up or disappear entirely? Flow states are neurologically significant. They correlate with high dopamine, high norepinephrine, and deep engagement of the default mode network in a positive direction. They are one of the brain's strongest signals that you are in alignment with your capacities. Phase 3 is called narrative integration. By this point, you have raw material: memories, values, experiments, emotional data. Phase 3 is about turning that raw material into a coherent story. This is where the default mode network does its deepest work. You need to give it inputs and then give it space. Research on insight and creativity consistently shows that the default mode network produces its most integrated outputs not during focused work, but during rest, specifically during activities like walking, showering, sleeping, and unfocused relaxation. These states allow the brain to combine experiences and form new patterns of meaning. Build what we call a purpose statement draft. This is not a polished mission statement. It is a rough, working hypothesis. It should complete this sentence: I am someone who uses my capacity for blank, to do blank, in a world that needs blank. Fill in each blank based on your excavation and your experiments. Do not try to make it sound impressive. Make it feel true. Then test the draft by reading it aloud to yourself every morning for 2 weeks. Pay attention to how it feels in your body. The anterior cingulate cortex will give you feedback. If the statement generates conflict, a sense of that's not quite right, revise it. If it generates a sense of settling, of recognition, of yes, that's it, Your brain is confirming alignment. Phase 4 is called committed action. This is where most purpose-finding processes collapse. People do the reflection. They find something that feels true, and then they do not act. Or they act so cautiously that the dopamine pathways never get properly conditioned. The neuroscience is clear here. Action must be consistent, and it must involve genuine effort. A study from University College London found that the dopamine system is calibrated by effort, meaning that the reward signal is stronger for achievements that required real cost. Easy wins train weak motivation. Hard-won progress trains deep drive. Choose one domain that your Phase 3 statement points to and commit to, showing up in that domain at least 4 days a week for 90 days. This does not need to be a job change or a dramatic life pivot. It can be 2 hours on a side project. It can be daily practice of a craft. What matters is consistency and effort, because these are what build the dopamine pathways that make purpose feel effortless over time. Use what behavioral scientists call implementation intentions. Specific, pre-decided plans in the format of when X happens, I will do Y. For example, when I sit down after dinner, I will spend 45 minutes on this project. Research by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer shows that implementation intentions increase follow-through rates dramatically compared to vague intentions, because they offload the decision from the effortful prefrontal cortex to automatic habit circuits. Track your effort, not your outcomes. Outcomes are often outside your control and depend on external factors. Effort is entirely within your control and is the actual input your brain needs to build meaningful pathways. Let's bring this all together. Your brain has 3 systems at the heart of purpose: the default mode network, which builds your identity narrative; the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which encodes what feels worth pursuing; and the anterior cingulate cortex, which monitors whether your life is in alignment with your values. Purpose is not a discovery. It is a construction. It is built through excavating your existing identity, generating real experiential data through action, integrating that data into a coherent narrative, and then reinforcing that narrative through consistent, effortful commitment. There is no shortcut, but there is a process. And that process is grounded in how your brain actually works, not in motivational abstraction. The people who seem to have found their purpose are not luckier than you. They are simply further along a process that their brain was always capable of completing. And now you know what that process is. If you want to go deeper into how your brain builds identity, how dopamine shapes motivation, or how to use neuroscience to upgrade the way you learn, work, and relate, subscribe to NeuroWise. We publish new science-based content every week, built for people who want to understand the engine that runs everything: the brain. Science for your everyday brain. We'll see you in the next one.